Okay, welcome everyone to Astrorisa Talk, where all things sacred to Yamada and Ashura Herbal are discussed. We are having another discussion about health. We welcome everyone again. We did talk about 2012. We were going to talk about genres. Last time, we did talk about healing with the earth, why it's important for indigenous people to become more aware of dealing with recycling. And at this point, we are now going to talk about approaching mental health from an indigenous perspective, an African philosophy perspective, so on and so forth. So I welcome everyone. We're going to begin with opening up with prayer, and then I'm going to introduce our guest. Omi tutu, ona tutu, ile tutu, tutu laroye, tutu arisha, tutu egungun. Olo dumare, ajubo bobo iku, olo watamlefe, olo dumare, ibatarong. We give honor to all the ancestors, chiefly ancestors that kneel before God. We give honor to all of the enlightened ancestors of all of our listeners that kneel before God. We give honor to Onile, the earth. And we give honor to each and every one of the four-legged, the two-legged, the winged, the standing still people. And again, earth, thank you, everyone. May no negativity come between us. May no negative energy surround us as we talk about this very spiritual subject. Thank you again for joining Astrorisa Moon Talk. We have a guest with us. Our guest is Adisa Ajani Akinyele, also known as Anthony Greenidge. And Brother Adisa is a student of Yoruba culture, spirituality, and African philosophy, as well as indigenous culture. He is a clinically trained mental health and substance abuse counselor. He's licensed in the state of North Carolina as clinical addiction specialist and clinical supervisor intern. Brother Adisa, as he is called by those in the community, has also worked as a diversity trainer, mediator, multicultural events programmer. Brother Adisa also is the owner and operator of Multi-Centric Solutions, a recovery counseling agency based in North Carolina in the Durham area that provides culturally based counseling, intervention, education, and programming to groups and individuals seeking balance and recovery from mental health and substance issues. The main influences for Adisa Akinyele have been Dr. Naeem Akbar, Dr. Jawanza Kunjufu, Dr. Joy Leary, Dr. Nathan and Julia Hare, Alba T. Shaka, Malcolm X, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Dr. C.T. Vivian, John Henry Clark, Dr. Leonard Jeffries, Dr. Malana Karenga, Dr. Angela Davis, Reverend T.D. Jakes, and a multitude of other authors and speakers. Wow, a lot of very influential people have been part of this young man's life. Thank you for joining us, Adisa Akinyele. How are you?
I am truly blessed tonight.
Wonderful. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. So we're going to be talking about this whole subject of, mental health, but approaching it from an indigenous perspective. And I use the term indigenous because it is incorporating a multitude of expressions of spirituality. Don't want to just box us into one type of thought process. So that's why we're looking at it from that perspective. And, of course, we all are dealing with some form of African spirituality, and so we are also looking at it from that perspective as well. I do want to also look at it from a cultural perspective, because spirituality and culture are really one and the same. So I'm really interested to see what it is that you are, your approach, and how you're sharing that with us all today.
Well, thank you. I think first I'd like to start off with a quote from Dr. Joy Leary about the whole concept of time. And the way she uses this quote, it kind of sets up the whole paradigm of what she's talking about in her book, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. For some cultures, time is something to be parsed, counted, and measured. Time can be lost, saved, and gained. It is a resource. Some people have little of it, while others have a lot. In other cultures, time is seen as an infinite resource, a force with which they have to live. In still other cultures, like those in Africa, time is not something for us to control. It is something with which we attune ourselves. Life has a rhythm and a flowing, and flowing with it is what is important. And so using that as an opening, looking at it from the standpoint of how we are set up from the time, from before we're born to what we accept as important values, important structures in our society, important ideals that we ascribe to, often sets us up for the ills of mental health. Because in indigenous cultures, we have other ways of viewing what some would call disease or a mental health issue. We might view that in an African tradition, as well as other indigenous traditions, very, very differently. If we go back to Ma'at and the 42 precepts, where it talks about one should never be too sad or never be too worried. Throughout our history as people in this country, we have been prescribed a particular culture, a particular way of viewing the world, a particular way of viewing ourselves and our place in the world. And so that prescription also includes mental illness. And so when we look at things like anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, or hearing voices, seeing, having hallucinations, one concept, in which happens to be the mainstream concept, says that that's a disease. But those may also be signals if we choose to view them in a different way. Those could be warnings. They could be messages sent by our ancestors to tell us that there are things that we need to do here on this earthly realm that only they would be able to tap into in the spiritual realm. And so a lot of times it's real difficult to explain to folks who only have one mode of looking at a disease or a state of being as that. And then what goes along with that is there must be a cure, or there must be something to rid ourselves of it, versus flowing with it, using it to our advantage, and developing it. And so, as you can see, on every level, when we buy into the quote-unquote mainstream way of viewing mental illness or a mental discord or just a mental state, we tend to disconnect ourselves from our natural state or our indigenous state because it devalues our indigenous state. And it further separates us from our true self. And so if I understand that I'm following my and I'm learning all the principles and how to work with these and what they mean to provide balance for my life, if I hear voices, then that doesn't justify going to a psychiatrist or a psychologist and getting a prescription to rid myself of the voices. I would go to an indigenous spiritual person who could interpret what I've experienced, give me some feedback on it, and then give me a spiritual prescription so that I could either move to the next level and enhance that spirituality or that gift, or I could answer if it's something that requires an answer. It may be something that requires me to do something with my time, with my energy. And so my thoughts are that the closer we get to our indigenous culture and spirituality, the less likely we will be to having a mental illness or accepting the label of a mental illness.